Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to another powerful and educational episode on the English Globe. We're so happy to have you with us today. Whether you're listening from Asia, Africa, Europe, or anywhere in the world, thank you for taking the time to learn English with us through important historical stories that truly matter. This episode is a very special one because we're diving into one of the most important turning points in modern history.
That's right, Adam. Today we're going to talk about a topic that shaped not just the United States, but the entire world. World War II and America's journey from isolation to global superpower. This is a story of fear, conflict, transformation, and power. And understanding it helps us not only improve our English, but also understand how our world works today, politically, economically, and socially.
Exactly, Julia. Many learners know that America is one of the most powerful countries in the world now, but very few people understand how that happened. Believe it or not, there was a time when the U.S. wanted nothing to do with the rest of the world's problems. It stayed neutral, quiet, and far from war. But then something changed, something big, and that change led to America becoming a global leader after 1945.
And that's what makes today's episode so important. When we understand how the past shaped the present, we learn how to think critically, make better decisions, and speak more confidently. So, to all our wonderful English learners out there, stay with us till the end because this podcast is going to give you both knowledge and powerful English practice that you can use in everyday life and conversation.
Before we begin, dear listeners, we would like to kindly ask you to support this channel by clicking the like button, subscribing to the English Globe, and sharing this episode with your friends and classmates. It really helps us grow and bring you more valuable content. And don't forget to tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? We love hearing from people in every corner of the globe.
Yes. And most importantly, we want to hear your thoughts and opinions on today's topic. Do you think America made the right decision by joining World War II? Was it the beginning of a better world or a more dangerous one? Your comments and ideas matter because this is not just a podcast. It's a global conversation, and you are a part of it.
Now, let's begin by going back in time. Not to the war itself, but to the years just after World War I. In the 1920s and 1930s, America was not the powerful international leader we know today. In fact, after the horror and destruction of World War I, many Americans wanted to stay far away from European politics and military conflicts. They believed in focusing on problems at home and not getting involved in foreign wars again.
This idea was called isolationism. It was the belief that America should avoid alliances, wars, and political entanglements with other countries. After the pain and suffering of World War I, the American people didn't want to risk more lives in overseas conflicts. So the US government passed laws to keep the country neutral. It avoided signing treaties, and it even refused to join the League of Nations, the international group formed to prevent future wars.
But even as America turned inward, the world outside was becoming more dangerous. In Europe, Germany was struggling after its defeat in World War I. Its economy collapsed, people were angry, and in this moment of crisis, a man named Adolf Hitler came to power, promising to make Germany strong again. In Asia, Japan began expanding its military and attacking neighboring countries. And in Italy, a dictator named Mussolini was also dreaming of empire.
These leaders didn't believe in peace or cooperation. They believed in conquest, nationalism, and military power. As the 1930s passed, they became more aggressive, invading countries, breaking international agreements, and building weapons. But still, America stayed on the sidelines, watching nervously but refusing to take action. The question was, how long could the US remain isolated while the world moved closer to war again?
That's the question we'll be exploring throughout this podcast. Today, we'll follow the timeline of how the U.S. moved from neutrality to full-scale war, and how that war transformed the country into a world leader. We'll look at battles, political speeches, economic changes, and social movements, But most of all, we'll try to answer this big question. How did World War II change America forever?
It's going to be a deep, thoughtful journey through history and language. So grab your notebook, stay with us, and don't forget to pause and repeat sentences if you want to practice your pronunciation. We are here to guide you every step of the way. In the next section, we'll take a closer look at the events of the 1930s that set the stage for war, from Europe to Asia, and how America reacted from a distance.
So get ready, dear listeners. This is more than a story. It's a lesson in language, history, and the power of global events. Once again, thank you for being here with us on the English Globe. We'll see you in the next section.
Now that we understand how deeply the United States believed in isolation after World War I, we need to explore what was happening in the rest of the world during the 1930s, a decade full of fear, economic collapse, and rising dictatorships. While America was focused on solving problems inside its own borders, countries in both Europe and Asia were heading toward new and dangerous paths that would soon affect every corner of the world, including the United States.
Let's begin with Germany, a country that had been defeated in World War I and punished severely by the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty made Germany pay huge amounts of money, give up land, and accept full responsibility for starting the war. As a result, the German economy collapsed. There was massive unemployment, people lost their homes, food became expensive, and many citizens felt angry, humiliated, and hopeless about their future and their country's survival.
In this moment of national crisis, a political leader named Adolf Hitler began to rise. He was a powerful speaker who promised to restore Germany's pride, rebuild its military, and create jobs for everyone. He blamed Jews, communists, and foreign countries for Germany's problems and used hate and fear to unite people under his vision of a strong Germany. By 1933, Hitler became the Chancellor and quickly turned Germany into a dictatorship with no room for opposition.
Under Hitler's leadership, Germany ignored the rules set by the Treaty of Versailles. It began building tanks, planes, and submarines, all weapons that were supposed to be illegal. The Nazi Party controlled newspapers, schools, and every part of German life. Jews were treated as enemies. New racist laws were passed, and at the same time, Hitler started dreaming of expanding Germany's territory by invading nearby countries to create what he called living space for the German people.
While this was happening in Europe, Japan was becoming more aggressive in Asia. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a region in northeastern China, claiming it needed natural resources. This attack was just the beginning. Soon after, Japan began a full-scale war against China in 1937. Japanese forces bombed cities, killed civilians, and committed terrible acts of violence. Japan's leaders, like Germany's, believed they were racially superior and had the right to dominate others.
At the same time in Italy, another dictator was rising. His name was Benito Mussolini, and he created a system called fascism, which focused on extreme nationalism, military power, and the idea that the government should control all aspects of life. Mussolini wanted to rebuild the Roman Empire, and in 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, an African country, in a brutal war that shocked the world. Still, the international community did very little to stop him.
As you can see, the 1930s were full of growing danger. Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, and military leaders in Japan were building empires, ignoring international laws and using violence to get what they wanted. These three countries, Germany, Italy, and Japan, would soon form an alliance called the Axis powers, and together they would push the world into war. But during this time, the United States continued to stand back, watching from the sidelines.
The American government was very aware of these developments, but it did not want to get involved. In fact, Congress passed several Neutrality Acts during the 1930s. These laws made it illegal for American companies to sell weapons to countries at war. The goal was to avoid being pulled into another global conflict. Most Americans believed that joining World War I had been a mistake, and that the best way to stay safe was to stay out of foreign problems completely.
Even when terrible things were happening, like the bombing of Chinese cities by Japan or the violent racism in Nazi Germany, many Americans still believed it was not their responsibility to interfere. They thought the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans would protect them from any danger. Isolation wasn't just a policy, it was a deep national feeling. People wanted to focus on their jobs, families, and recovering from the Great Depression, which had hurt millions across the country.
The Great Depression made the situation even more complex. In 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed, and it caused a worldwide economic crisis. In America, banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment reached record highs. With so much suffering at home, Americans didn't want to spend money or resources on foreign wars. They wanted the government to focus on domestic programs that could help them survive and rebuild their lives after years of poverty and hunger.
But not everyone agreed with total isolation. Some leaders, writers, and citizens believed that ignoring these growing threats was dangerous. They argued that if America didn't help stop Hitler, Mussolini, and Japan's aggression early, the world would face an even greater disaster. This debate between isolationists and interventionists would become louder and more urgent as the 1930s came to an end and Europe moved closer to war once again.
One of the most important moments happened in 1938, when Hitler's army marched into Austria and took control without firing a shot. Later that year, he demanded the Sudetenland, a part of Czechoslovakia, saying it belonged to Germany. Britain and France, hoping to avoid another war, agreed to give him this land in what became known as the Munich Agreement. Many believed that giving Hitler what he wanted would bring peace, but Hitler only became more confident.
This moment showed the failure of appeasement, the idea that if you give in to a bully, they will stop being aggressive. Instead of being satisfied, Hitler continued expanding. By 1939, he signed a secret agreement with the Soviet Union and invaded Poland. Britain and France finally realized they had no choice but to respond. On September 1st, 1939, World War II officially began. And while the fighting exploded in Europe, America still held back from joining.
So, by the end of the 1930s, the world had changed completely. Powerful dictators were using violence and fear to take control. Countries were being invaded, cities were being bombed, and innocent people were suffering. Yet the United States remained neutral. It wasn't ready to enter another global war. But that would soon change, and the moment that changed everything happened in 1941 in a place called Pearl Harbor.
In our next section, we'll take you to that unforgettable day when America was attacked and forced to make a decision that would change history forever. But before we go, dear listeners, we'd love to know, what do you think America should have done during the 1930s? Should it have stayed isolated or taken early action against rising dictators? Let us know your opinion in the comments.
And once again, thank you for joining us. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like this podcast, subscribe to the English Globe, and tell us where you're listening from. Your support makes it possible for us to create more content that helps you learn English while understanding the world. Stay with us. The story is just beginning. In our last section, we explored how powerful dictators rose to power in Germany, Japan, and Italy, while the United States chose to watch from a distance. Even though the world was clearly heading toward war, the majority of Americans still believed that staying out of foreign conflicts was the smartest and safest path. But as World War II officially began in 1939, this position became harder and harder to defend, both politically and morally.
Let's take a closer look at why America remained neutral in the early years of the war. One major reason was public opinion. After World War I, Many Americans believed that they had been tricked into joining that war by greedy arms manufacturers and dishonest politicians. They didn't want to make the same mistake again. This belief was so strong that Congress passed several neutrality acts to keep the country out of any future wars, no matter what was happening overseas.
The Neutrality Acts, passed between 1935 and 1939, were designed to prevent the U.S. from being dragged into foreign wars like it had been in 1917. These laws made it illegal for American companies to sell weapons or lend money to countries at war. The goal was simple. If the United States did not take sides, then it could avoid being pulled into the fighting. But these laws also limited the U.S. government's ability to respond to real threats as they grew stronger each year.
At the same time, many Americans were still suffering from the effects of the Great Depression. People were focused on getting jobs, feeding their families, and rebuilding their lives after years of financial struggle. Helping countries like Britain or China felt like a distraction from domestic problems. Politicians who supported isolationism argued that America needed to fix itself first before it could think about saving the world from dictators or global war.
One of the loudest voices for isolationism was a group called America First Committee. This group believed that getting involved in another European war would bring nothing but suffering and debt. They held rallies, printed newspapers, and even brought in famous Americans like pilot Charles Lindbergh to speak against joining the war. Their message was simple and powerful: protect American lives by staying out of other countries' problems.
But not everyone agreed with this message. There were many Americans, including President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who believed that the growing danger from Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan could not be ignored forever. These people were called interventionists, and they argued that by staying neutral, America was only giving more time and power to the dictators. They believed that helping friendly countries now might prevent a larger war later.
So by the late 1930s, America was divided. On one side were the isolationists, who believed in peace through distance. On the other side were the interventionists, who believed in peace through strength and support. President Roosevelt found himself walking a very thin line. He wanted to help allies like Britain and France, but he also didn't want to anger the American public or break the law. So he began to find creative ways to support the war effort quietly.
One of the first signs of this shift was the cash and carry policy in 1939. This allowed countries at war to buy American weapons as long as they paid cash and used their own ships to carry the goods. This was designed to help Britain and France without officially taking sides. It also gave the US economy a small boost by creating demand for goods like planes, trucks, and ammunition, all while staying technically neutral under the law.
But when France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, things changed quickly. Suddenly, Britain was standing alone against Hitler. The situation looked terrifying. If Britain lost, there would be no strong countries left to fight the Axis powers. That's when Roosevelt decided to go further. In March 1941, he introduced something called the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the U.S. to send weapons, food, and supplies to countries fighting against the Axis, especially the United Kingdom.
The Lend-Lease Act was controversial. Isolationists said it would pull America directly into the war. Interventionists said it was the only way to stop Hitler without sending American soldiers. Roosevelt defended the program by comparing it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. "Would you let your neighbor's house burn down just because you didn't want to get involved?" he asked. This powerful image convinced many people that helping now could prevent disaster later.
Meanwhile, things were getting worse in Asia too. Japan continued its brutal campaign in China and expanded its control over Southeast Asia. The U.S. began to cut off oil and steel shipments to Japan, hoping to stop its aggression without firing a shot. Japan, in return, began to feel cornered and angry. Tensions between the two countries were rising fast, and soon, this would lead to one of the most shocking attacks in American history.
But before we get to that, Let's take a moment to reflect. The years between 1939 and 1941 were a time of deep debate in America. People argued in newspapers, on the radio, and in Congress. Should the US risk war to protect freedom in Europe, or should it stay out completely and focus on its own survival? These were not easy questions. Even today, historians still argue about whether the US should have done more or less before Pearl Harbor changed everything.
Dear listeners, what do you think? Was the United States right to stay neutral during the early years of World War II? Or should it have done more to stop the rise of dictators in Europe and Asia? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We really appreciate hearing your opinions because this is not just about history. It's about how people think, feel, and choose to act in difficult times.
And before we move on, don't forget to like this episode if you're enjoying it, subscribe to the English Globe for more long, high-quality English podcasts, and share this with someone who loves learning both English and world history. We're here to support your journey, and every like and comment helps us reach more learners around the world.
In our next section, we'll talk about one of the darkest and most unforgettable days in American history, the attack on Pearl Harbor. This moment didn't just shock the United States, it changed its future forever. So stay with us, because things are about to take a dramatic and emotional turn in our story of how America went from isolation to becoming a superpower. It's also important to mention that the attack on Pearl Harbor raised difficult questions about race, loyalty, and fear within the United States. After the attack, many Americans became suspicious of people of Japanese descent, including those who were born in the United States and had never been to Japan. This fear led to one of the most controversial decisions in American history, the forced relocation and internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans in camps.
These internment camps were located in remote areas of the country, far from cities and communities. Families were given very little time to pack their belongings. They had to leave behind their homes, jobs, schools, and businesses. They were moved into crowded barracks surrounded by fences and guards. Even though most of them were loyal citizens, they were treated as enemies simply because of their ancestry. It's a sad and painful chapter in America's response to fear and war.
At the same time, Pearl Harbor became a rallying point for unity and courage. Across the nation, people from all walks of life, rich and poor, urban and rural, black and white, came together with a shared goal. They believed that America had a duty to respond with strength, not only to defend itself, but also to fight for justice around the world. The country began building ships, planes, and tanks faster than ever before. Factories ran day and night. The age of American mobilization had begun.
The US also needed to prepare for a two-front war, one in Europe, where Hitler was continuing his brutal campaign across the continent, and the other in the Pacific, where Japan was capturing islands and threatening US allies. It was a massive challenge. Troops had to be trained, equipment had to be produced, and strategies had to be created. America's leaders knew that this war would not be short or easy, but they believed that freedom was worth the fight.
This was also a time of tremendous leadership. President Roosevelt gave powerful speeches to unite the nation and inspire confidence. He said, "We are going to win this war and the peace that follows." His words were broadcast on radios in every home, creating a sense of shared mission. General Douglas MacArthur led U.S. forces in the Pacific. In Europe, General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later lead the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France. These men became symbols of American strength.
American families sent their sons and daughters into battle, not knowing if they would return. Newspapers printed stories of heroism and sacrifice. Films and songs were created to support morale. Meanwhile, the country's economy started to recover rapidly because of wartime production. Millions of jobs were created, and people finally began earning money again after the long years of the Great Depression. War, while tragic, had sparked a powerful wave of growth and national focus.
But it wasn't just about machines and soldiers. the war became a test of values, a struggle between democracy and dictatorship, between freedom and oppression. Americans were told that they were fighting for the right of all people to live without fear. They were fighting against the darkness spreading across Europe and Asia. This moral purpose helped give meaning to the suffering and sacrifices that so many families were enduring during this difficult time.
The shock of Pearl Harbor reminded Americans that the world had changed. Geography no longer offered safety. Technology made it possible for distant countries to strike quickly and with great power. Isolation was no longer a realistic option. The United States had to engage, not withdraw. It had to lead, not hide. The attack had woken the sleeping giant, as Japanese Admiral Yamamoto described the US, and that giant was now preparing for total war on a global scale.
In our next section, we'll explore how the United States began to mobilize its economy, people, and industries to fight a global war. You'll learn how the nation shifted its entire system from peace to war in record time. We'll look at how ordinary citizens became heroes, how women entered the workforce in new roles, and how the American spirit of determination led to something incredible: the creation of the world's strongest military and industrial machine.
This was a time of great change and courage, but also of fear and sacrifice. As we continue this story, we encourage you to reflect on the lessons that Pearl Harbor taught the world, that peace cannot be taken for granted, and that silence in the face of aggression has a cost. The path from isolation to superpower was not easy, but it was a journey that would redefine America forever. Stay with us as we move into the next phase of this powerful and unforgettable journey. When the United States officially entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the country faced one of the most urgent and massive challenges in its history: transforming an economy built for peace into one capable of fighting a global war. This was not just about building weapons or training soldiers, it was about changing the way an entire society functioned. It required every part of the nation to come together, to work, to sacrifice, and to believe in a shared mission.
In 1941, the United States was not fully prepared for a war of this size. The military was relatively small. Factories were producing civilian goods like cars and washing machines, not tanks or airplanes. But after Pearl Harbor, that changed quickly. The government began working closely with businesses to shift production toward military needs. This was called war mobilization, and it became one of the most impressive industrial efforts in world history. The results were fast and powerful.
The US government created new agencies to manage this huge transformation. One of the most important was the War Production Board, WPB, which was responsible for deciding which factories would make what kinds of products. Companies like Ford, which had once produced cars, started building tanks, jeeps, and bombers. The General Motors Company stopped making consumer vehicles and started producing engines for warplanes. Everything was focused on one goal: victory.
This rapid change in industry became known as the arsenal of democracy, a phrase first used by President Roosevelt. It described how American factories would become the tools for defeating the Axis powers. In just a few years, the United States built more than 300,000 airplanes, 100,000 tanks, and 2.5 million trucks. American shipyards created thousands of Liberty ships, cargo vessels used to transport weapons and supplies to allies across the oceans.
To make all of this possible, the country needed a massive labor force. Millions of men had joined the military, so factories needed new workers. This led to a dramatic change in the American workforce. For the first time in history, millions of women entered industries that had previously been closed to them. They became welders, machinists, engineers, and factory supervisors. This movement was symbolized by a famous character named Rosie the Riveter, who represented strength and courage.
Rosie the Riveter appeared on posters with the slogan, "We can do it." and became a symbol of women's power during the war. These women worked long hours in difficult conditions, often while also caring for children and elderly family members. They showed the country that women could do any job that men could, and do it just as well. Their contribution was not just helpful, it was absolutely essential to America's success in the war effort.
But women were not the only group stepping into new roles. African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and Asian Americans also played major roles in the war industry and in the military. Although discrimination and racism were still strong in many parts of the country, the demands of war created new opportunities for people of color. More than 1 million African Americans served in the armed forces, and many others worked in factories, building weapons and equipment.
These changes brought both hope and tension. On one hand, minority workers finally had access to better jobs, higher pay, and greater visibility. On the other hand, discrimination didn't disappear. African American soldiers often served in segregated units, and many were not given the same respect or recognition as white soldiers. Still, the war planted seeds for future civil rights movements by showing that people of all backgrounds could serve, sacrifice, and lead with honor.
One important example was the Tuskegee Airmen, a group of African American pilots trained in Alabama who went on to become some of the most skilled and respected fighter pilots in the war. Despite facing racism and limited support, they completed hundreds of successful missions in Europe and helped change attitudes about race and ability. Their story is just one of many that show how the war helped break down barriers and create new possibilities for the future.
On the home front, Americans were asked to make sacrifices in their daily lives to support the war. The government launched rationing programs to ensure that enough food, fuel, rubber, and other materials were available for soldiers. Families received ration books with coupons that limited how much sugar, meat, or gasoline they could buy. People collected scrap metal and rubber, planted victory gardens to grow their own vegetables, and bought war bonds to support the military financially.
The war also led to a huge increase in government spending. In order to pay for weapons, supplies, and salaries for millions of soldiers and workers, the federal government spent more money than ever before. Taxes were increased, and for the first time, millions of ordinary workers began paying income tax. This spending helped lift the country out of the Great Depression by creating jobs and stimulating economic growth, even though it also led to higher national debt.
Schools and newspapers also became part of the war effort. Children were taught to be patriotic and to support the troops. They joined groups like the Boy Scouts or Junior Red Cross to help collect supplies and write letters to soldiers. Newspapers published daily reports about battles and victories. Films and radio shows told heroic stories of soldiers fighting for freedom. Even Hollywood got involved, making movies that supported the cause and boosted national pride.
During this time, a strong sense of national unity developed. Americans from different backgrounds, classes, and regions came together with one shared goal: to win the war. People believed that they were not just fighting for their country, but for the future of democracy and peace. This sense of purpose gave them strength to work longer hours, endure hardship, and send loved ones into dangerous battles overseas. It was a rare and powerful moment of unity in U.S. history.
Of course, not everything was perfect. As we mentioned in the last section, fear and suspicion also led to injustice, especially toward Japanese Americans. But overall, the period of mobilization showed what the United States could do when it put its full energy, resources, and creativity into solving a national problem. It proved that America could become a global force, not just through military strength, but through industry, innovation, and the courage of ordinary people.
In our next section, we'll follow the American military onto the battlefield. We'll explore how U.S. soldiers fought in both Europe and the Pacific, what major battles they faced, and how their experiences helped shape the outcome of the war. From the beaches of Normandy to the islands of the Pacific Ocean, the American role in combat was complex, heroic, and often heartbreaking. Stay with us as we continue this story of transformation, sacrifice, and rising power.
As American factories roared to life and the nation fully mobilized at home, the focus shifted to the brutal and complex battles being fought across two major theaters of war: Europe and the Pacific. American soldiers, sailors, pilots, and Marines were now being deployed by the millions to distant parts of the world where they would face unimaginable challenges. These battles were not only military operations, but moments that would define the 20th century and shape America's identity as a global leader.
Let's begin with the European theatre, where the United States fought alongside allies like Britain, France, and later the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. One of the first major campaigns that involved American forces was in North Africa, where the Allies launched Operation Torch in 1942. The goal was to gain control of the Mediterranean and prepare for an invasion of southern Europe. US troops, many fighting for the first time, faced experienced German soldiers under General Erwin Rommel.
The North Africa campaign helped American forces gain valuable experience and tested the effectiveness of their training and equipment. After months of difficult fighting in the deserts of Tunisia, Allied forces were able to defeat German and Italian troops and prepare for the next stage, an invasion of Italy. In 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily, and soon after, they pushed into mainland Italy. This campaign was long and bloody as German forces resisted fiercely in the mountainous terrain.
Italy eventually surrendered, and its fascist leader Benito Mussolini was overthrown. However, German troops continued to fight in Italy, and progress was slow. Meanwhile, the most important military planning was happening across the English Channel, where Allied leaders prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in history. This operation would strike at the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe and open a Western front that could push Hitler's army back toward Germany.
This leads us to one of the most famous and heroic days in American military history: D-Day, or June 6, 1944. On this day, American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The landings were incredibly dangerous. Soldiers had to jump into cold water while bullets rained down from German bunkers. The beaches, like Omaha Beach and Utah Beach, became scenes of intense bravery and sacrifice.
Despite heavy losses, the invasion was successful. The Allies broke through the German defences and began liberating towns and cities across France. French citizens welcomed them with tears and cheers, waving flags and hugging soldiers. The success of D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Over the next year, Allied forces would push through Belgium, the Netherlands, and into Germany, fighting deadly battles along the way.
One of the hardest battles came in late 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. It was Hitler's last major offensive on the Western Front. He sent thousands of troops through the forests of Belgium in an attempt to split the Allied forces. Caught by surprise, American soldiers faced freezing temperatures, snowstorms, and fierce fighting. But they held the line. After weeks of brutal combat, the German advance was stopped, and the Allies regained control. This victory showed the strength and courage of the U.S. military.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a very different kind of war was being fought: the Pacific Theatre. Here, the enemy was the Japanese Empire, and the geography made the conflict uniquely difficult. Instead of cities and farmlands, soldiers had to fight across vast oceans, dense jungles, and remote islands. The war in the Pacific was marked by brutal hand-to-hand combat, long naval battles, and an intense struggle for each piece of land.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan quickly expanded across the Pacific, capturing the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and many others. American and Filipino troops were forced to surrender in the Philippines after a long battle at Bataan, and many died during the Bataan Death March. But soon, the tide began to turn. In 1942, American forces won two key battles that changed the course of the war: the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway.
The Battle of Midway was especially important. In this battle, American aircraft carriers ambushed the Japanese fleet and destroyed 4 of their carriers. This victory crippled Japan's ability to launch large attacks and gave the US control of the Pacific Seas. From this point forward, the United States adopted a strategy known as island hopping, capturing one island at a time and moving closer to Japan's main islands. Each battle was bloody, exhausting, and full of danger.
One of the first major land victories came at Guadalcanal, where American Marines fought for 6 months to take control of the island. It was a turning point. Then came Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, each battle harder than the last. At Iwo Jima, thousands of U.S. Marines died trying to take the island, but their courage led to victory. A photo of U.S. soldiers raising the flag on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of hope and bravery across the country.
Perhaps the most difficult and deadly battle was at Okinawa in 1945. Over 12,000 Americans and over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians died. Japanese forces used suicide tactics called kamikaze attacks, where pilots crashed their planes into American ships. The battle was a brutal preview of what an invasion of mainland Japan might look like: long, deadly, and incredibly costly. US military leaders realized that a direct invasion of Japan could lead to millions of deaths.
As these battles raged, American soldiers showed immense bravery, strength, and resilience. Many were very young, just 18 or 19 years old. They wrote letters to their families, carried photos of loved ones, and fought not just for survival, but for a better future. Their courage helped turn the tide of war and brought the world closer to peace. But victory was not yet certain. There were still decisions to be made, some of them difficult and even controversial.
In our next section, we'll discuss how the United States used its greatest scientific breakthrough, the atomic bomb, to end the war with Japan. We'll explore the ethical debates, the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and how these events forever changed the meaning of war. We'll also look at how the end of the war marked the beginning of a new world, one where the United States would no longer be a distant observer, but a central player in global politics and power.
As World War II reached its final phase, the United States found itself facing a difficult and painful choice. The battles in Europe had ended, and Nazi Germany had finally surrendered. But in the Pacific, Japan continued to fight fiercely, showing no signs of surrender. After the deadly and exhausting campaigns in places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, American military leaders believed that a full invasion of Japan would lead to even greater loss of life, possibly costing millions of soldiers and civilians.
At the same time, a secret American scientific project was nearing completion. A project that would change the world forever. It was called the Manhattan Project, and it had been created in 1942 to build the most powerful weapon ever imagined, the atomic bomb. This top-secret project involved thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers from across the United States, working in complete secrecy at sites in New Mexico, Tennessee, and Washington State. Their mission was simple, but the consequences were not.
The atomic bomb used the power of nuclear fission, a process that releases an enormous amount of energy by splitting atoms. Scientists like J. Robert Oppenheimer, known as the father of the atomic bomb, worked day and night to develop and test the new technology. By July 1945, the first test bomb, known as Trinity, was successfully detonated in the desert of New Mexico. The explosion created a blinding light, a massive mushroom cloud, and a deep fear of what this power could do.
Soon after the Trinity test, American leaders faced a difficult decision. Should they use the atomic bomb to end the war quickly, even if it meant killing thousands of civilians? Or should they continue the conventional war, risking even more lives in a possible invasion of Japan's home islands. President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office after Franklin D. Roosevelt's death, believed that using the bomb would save American lives and force Japan to surrender without a ground invasion.
On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The bomb, called Little Boy, exploded with unimaginable force. In just seconds, buildings were destroyed, fires erupted, and tens of thousands of people were killed instantly. Many more died in the days and weeks that followed due to burns, radiation sickness, and injuries. It was the first time in history that such a weapon had been used in war, and the results were devastating.
Still, Japan did not surrender. So, 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, a second bomb, called Fat Man, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. This bomb also caused enormous destruction and loss of life. Faced with the horrifying power of this new weapon and the threat of more attacks, Japan finally agreed to surrender. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, marking the end of World War II. This day became known as VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day.
The use of atomic bombs remains one of the most controversial decisions in history. Some argue that the bombs were necessary to end the war quickly and save lives. Others believe that Japan was already close to surrender and that using nuclear weapons on civilian populations was morally wrong. Historians still debate whether there were better alternatives, but what's certain is that the atomic bomb brought a new and terrifying kind of warfare into the world, one with the power to destroy entire cities in seconds.
For the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the suffering did not end after the bombs fell. Survivors, known as hibakusha, lived with physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Many developed cancer and other illnesses caused by radiation. Their homes, schools, and communities had been destroyed. For years, the Japanese people struggled to rebuild, and the memory of the bombings became a symbol of both unimaginable pain and the need to prevent such destruction from ever happening again.
At the same time, the atomic bomb changed America's role in the world. It showed that the United States now possessed a kind of power no other country had. This marked the beginning of a new era, the nuclear age. While the war had ended, a new global tension began to rise, especially between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which had become a powerful ally during the war, but soon turned into a rival. The world had entered a new kind of conflict, one based on fear of nuclear weapons and the balance of power.
But before we explore that new chapter in global history, it's important to reflect on what World War II meant for Americans. More than 16 million Americans served in the armed forces during the war. Over 400,000 of them lost their lives. Every family in the country was touched in some way, through sacrifice, separation, or grief. Yet, through this pain, the nation had grown stronger, more united, and more determined than ever to shape the post-war world in a way that would prevent future conflicts.
The war had also brought lasting changes to American society. Women who had entered the workforce during the war began demanding more rights and recognition. African American veterans returned home determined to fight segregation and racism, planting the seeds for the civil rights movement. The GI Bill helped returning soldiers go to college, buy homes, and build better lives, leading to a new middle class. The United States had emerged not just as a military superpower, but as a model of economic and democratic strength.
And while cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruins, the US economy was booming. Factories were running, people were employed, and industries were expanding. The experience of war had turned the US into a nation capable of leading the rebuilding process. Soon, America would play a key role in creating organizations like the United Nations, promoting peace, and helping former enemies like Japan and Germany become stable democracies. The country was no longer looking inward. It had become the leader of the free world.
Still, the legacy of the atomic bomb continues to shape international relations even today. The power of nuclear weapons remains a global concern. After the war, other nations began developing their own nuclear programs, leading to an arms race that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. What started as a secret wartime project would become the center of political debates, peace movements, and constant diplomatic negotiations for decades to come.
In our next section, we'll explore how the end of World War II gave birth to a new era known as the Cold War. We'll look at how tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union changed the world, and how America's journey from isolation to superpower continued to evolve in the face of new global challenges. Stay with us as we move into a new chapter of history, one full of hope, fear, and a continuing struggle for peace and progress. When World War II ended in 1945, celebrations filled the streets of many countries. People danced in the cities, families hugged returning soldiers, and a deep sense of relief swept across the world. After 6 long years of destruction, peace had finally come. But beneath the surface of joy and victory, a new struggle was beginning. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had started to break down, replaced by suspicion, disagreement, and a growing competition for global power.
During the war, the US and the Soviet Union had been allies against a common enemy, Nazi Germany. But once that enemy was defeated, old tensions quickly resurfaced. The two nations had very different political systems. The United States believed in democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, followed a communist system that placed control in the hands of the state. These opposing ideologies clashed, and both countries began to fear the spread of the other's influence.
In the years that followed, the world was divided into 2 main camps. One side was led by the United States, which supported free elections, individual rights, and open markets. The other side was led by the Soviet Union, which promoted central planning, one-party rule, and control over the economy and society. This division became known as the Cold War, not because the two sides directly fought on battlefields, but because the conflict was based on threats, spying, political pressure, and arms competition.
One of the earliest signs of this new Cold War came in Eastern Europe. As the war ended, Soviet troops remained in countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and East Germany. Instead of allowing free elections as promised, Stalin installed communist governments that followed Soviet orders. Western leaders, especially President Harry Truman, saw this as a betrayal of the agreements made during wartime conferences and a threat to the future of democracy in Europe.
To stop the spread of communism, the United States adopted a policy called containment. This meant using political, economic, and sometimes military tools to prevent Soviet power from expanding. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine was announced, promising support to countries resisting communist pressure. The first major test came in Greece and Turkey, where American aid helped stop Soviet-backed communist movements from taking over. This marked the beginning of active U.S. involvement in global affairs.
Soon after, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, a massive program to rebuild Europe's economy after the war. Named after Secretary of State George C. Marshall, the plan offered billions of dollars in aid to any European country willing to rebuild using American money and democratic values. Countries like France, Italy, and West Germany accepted the aid and began to recover quickly. The Soviet Union, however, rejected the plan and forced its satellite states to do the same.
As Europe began to rebuild, the world became physically divided as well. Nowhere was this more clear than in Germany, which had been split into 4 zones controlled by the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The capital city, Berlin, was also divided, even though it was deep inside Soviet-controlled territory. In 1948, tensions exploded when the Soviets blocked all roads and railways into West Berlin, trying to force the Allies out. but the US responded with the Berlin airlift.
The Berlin airlift was one of the most impressive peaceful operations in Cold War history. For almost a full year, American and British planes flew into West Berlin, delivering food, fuel, and supplies to over 2 million people. The operation showed the world that the U.S. would not back down in the face of aggression. Eventually, the Soviets lifted the blockade, but the message was clear. Germany, and Berlin in particular, would remain at the center of Cold War tensions for decades to come.
The Cold War also led to the creation of new military alliances. In 1949, the United States and several European countries formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, promising that if one member was attacked, all would respond together. This was a way to protect Western Europe from a possible Soviet invasion. In response, the Soviet Union created its own alliance in 1955, known as the Warsaw Pact. The world was now officially split into two armed camps.
At the same time, the Cold War moved beyond Europe. In Asia, the communist government of Mao Zedong took over China in 1949, creating another powerful ally for the Soviet Union. This shocked American leaders and increased fears of a domino effect, where one country after another might fall to communism. These fears would later lead the U.S. into wars in Korea and Vietnam, hoping to stop communist influence before it spread too far. The Cold War was becoming truly global.
But perhaps the most dangerous part of the Cold War was the arms race. After the success of the atomic bomb, the United States continued to develop more powerful weapons. The Soviet Union quickly built its own atomic bomb in 1949. This created a new era of fear, a world where both sides had the power to destroy each other completely. Soon, both countries developed hydrogen bombs, which were even more powerful than the ones dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
This led to a terrifying idea known as mutually assured destruction, MAD. The concept was simple. If one side used nuclear weapons, the other would respond with equal or greater force, leading to total destruction for both. This fear helped prevent direct war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but it also created constant tension, nuclear drills in schools, and a generation that lived under the shadow of possible global annihilation at any moment.
Despite the danger, the Cold War also pushed both nations to achieve remarkable things. In the race for global leadership, the US made major advancements in technology, education, space exploration, and science. This included the creation of NASA and the space race that would eventually put a man on the moon. At the same time, American culture, including music, films, and fashion, began to influence the world, spreading ideas of freedom, individualism, and opportunity.
In many ways, World War II had set the stage for America to become not just a military superpower, but a cultural and ideological leader. The country had moved from isolationism to active engagement in world affairs. It had helped rebuild Europe, resist the spread of communism, and define what it meant to be a modern, democratic nation. The cost had been great, but the influence and responsibility that came after were even greater.
In our next section, we'll explore how America's post-war leadership shaped the second half of the 20th century. We'll look at the country's efforts in diplomacy, the rise of the United Nations, and how the US positioned itself as the guardian of global peace, development, and progress, even as the Cold War continued. Join us as we continue uncovering how World War II changed not just one nation, but the entire future of the world.
Following the devastation of World War II, the world faced a tremendous challenge: how to create lasting peace and prevent another global conflict. Recognizing this urgent need, the United States took a leading role in establishing new international institutions designed to promote cooperation and security. One of the most important of these was the United Nations, founded in 1945, with the goal of providing a forum where countries could resolve disputes through dialogue rather than war.
The United Nations built on the failures of the earlier League of Nations, which had been created after World War I, but was unable to prevent the outbreak of the Second War. The US Senate had refused to join the League, but after World War II, America committed fully to the United Nations as a way to lead global diplomacy. The UN included powerful bodies like the Security Council, where the US, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China had permanent seats and veto power, reflecting their influence in world affairs.
Beyond diplomacy, the United States also led efforts to rebuild economies shattered by war. The Marshall Plan, which we discussed earlier, provided financial aid to Western European countries, helping them recover quickly and avoid the kind of economic despair that had contributed to the rise of fascism in the 1930s. The success of this plan strengthened democratic governments and opened new markets for American goods, benefiting both Europe and the U.S. economy.
America's leadership extended beyond Europe. In Asia, the US played a crucial role in the reconstruction of Japan. After Japan's surrender, American military leaders and diplomats worked to rebuild the country's economy, political system, and society. Under the guidance of General Douglas MacArthur, Japan adopted a new constitution that established democratic principles, including respect for human rights and the renunciation of war, as a national policy. This transformation helped turn a former enemy into a close American ally.
The U.S. also became deeply involved in efforts to prevent conflicts elsewhere. The creation of NATO in 1949, which we mentioned earlier, was a key part of America's strategy to protect Western democracies from Soviet aggression. NATO established a collective defense agreement, meaning an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. This organization remains a vital part of international security today and was a clear sign that America was committed to maintaining peace through strength and alliances.
At the same time, America's economic power grew rapidly during this period. The post-war years saw the rise of a strong middle class, fueled by new opportunities created by the GI Bill, which helped returning veterans buy homes, get education, and build careers. This economic growth was supported by technological advances developed during the war, such as improved manufacturing techniques, new materials, and innovations in transportation and communication. The US became a global economic powerhouse.
America's cultural influence also expanded worldwide. Movies from Hollywood, American music styles like jazz and rock and roll, and the spread of American fashion and consumer goods helped shape popular culture around the globe. This cultural soft power complemented America's political and military leadership, creating a strong image of the United States as a land of freedom, opportunity, and innovation, a sharp contrast to the communist Soviet Union.
However, this new world order was not without its challenges. The Cold War continued to fuel conflicts in different regions, and the threat of nuclear war remained ever present. America's involvement in Korea and later Vietnam reflected the complexities of maintaining global leadership in a divided world. Additionally, social struggles at home, including the fight for civil rights and gender equality, highlighted that America's promise of freedom was still a work in progress.
Despite these difficulties, the post-war period established the foundation for decades of relative peace between major powers, unprecedented economic growth, and significant technological and social progress. The United States had moved from an isolated nation to the leader of a global system designed to encourage cooperation, prosperity, and security. Its commitment to these goals shaped international relations and the world's future well beyond the mid-20th century.
As we look back on this remarkable transformation, it's clear that World War II was not just a conflict of armies and battles. It was a turning point that redefined the role of the United States on the global stage. The country's leadership helped build the institutions, alliances, and economic systems that continue to influence the world today. It was a journey marked by sacrifice, resilience, and vision. A journey from isolation to superpower that changed history forever. In our final section, we'll reflect on the lasting legacy of World War II for America and the world. We'll consider how the war shaped modern America's identity, values, and responsibilities, and why remembering this history is so important for future generations. Thank you for staying with us on this journey. We hope this story has deepened your understanding and appreciation of the past. As we reach the conclusion of our story about World War II and America's incredible journey from isolation to superpower, it is important to pause and reflect on the lasting legacy of this historic conflict. The war was one of the deadliest and most destructive events in human history, yet it also marked a turning point for the United States, shaping its identity and role in the world for decades to come. Understanding this legacy helps us appreciate the sacrifices made and the responsibilities inherited.
One of the most significant legacies of World War II is the transformation of America's place in global affairs. Before the war, the United States largely followed a policy of isolationism, avoiding entanglement in European or Asian conflicts. However, the scale and impact of the war showed that no nation could remain detached in an interconnected world. The war forced America to take on a leadership role, not only militarily but politically, economically, and morally.
The institutions and alliances created after the war, such as the United Nations and NATO, demonstrated America's commitment to a new system of international cooperation. These organizations aim to prevent another global conflict by encouraging dialogue, development, and collective security. The US became the anchor of this system, using its power to support peace and prosperity around the world while promoting democratic values and human rights.
At home, the war also brought deep changes to American society. Millions of men and women served in the armed forces, and millions more worked in industries that supported the war effort. This shared experience helped unite the country in a common purpose. Additionally, the contributions of women and minorities during the war laid the groundwork for future movements toward equality and civil rights. The GI Bill helped create a new middle class by providing education and housing opportunities to returning veterans.
The economic boom that followed the war created one of the most prosperous eras in American history. Technological innovations, improved education, and increased consumer demand helped build a strong and dynamic economy. This period also saw the rise of the United States as the world's leading scientific and technological power, with achievements such as the space program that captured the imagination of millions.
However, the legacy of World War II also includes difficult lessons. The horrors of the Holocaust and the devastation caused by the atomic bomb reminded the world of the terrible costs of hatred, totalitarianism, and war. These events emphasized the need for vigilance against injustice and the importance of international cooperation to protect peace. They also sparked ongoing debates about morality, war, and the use of powerful weapons.
The memory of the war continues to influence American culture and values. It is often seen as a good war, a conflict fought to defeat clear evil and defend freedom. This narrative shapes how many Americans understand patriotism, sacrifice, and national identity. Yet, it also challenges us to remember the complexities and costs of war, to honor the experiences of all who served, and to work toward a future where such conflicts can be avoided.
In today's world, the lessons of World War II remain relevant. Global challenges such as conflict, inequality, and threats to democracy remind us that peace and freedom require constant effort. The story of America's path from isolation to superpower encourages us to engage with the world responsibly, to stand up for justice, and to recognize our shared humanity across borders and cultures.
As we close this episode, we want to thank you, our dear listeners, for joining us on this journey through one of the most important chapters in modern history. We hope that understanding America's transformation during World War II helps you see how history shapes the present and future. Remembering these stories is essential for building a world based on peace, respect, and cooperation.
If this episode inspired you, please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Tell us how history influences your view of the world and what lessons you think are most important today. We look forward to hearing from you and continuing these conversations. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.